Good morning. Welcome to Green Meadow Church of Christ. It's good to be here. It's good to have you here. If you turn to the Gospel of John chapter 1, that's where we're going to start our lesson. Gospel of John chapter 1. I'd like to thank Hugh, Bill, Jim for your services this morning. Appreciate that. So the title of our sermon is Grace and Truth is the Only Proof. Grace and Truth is the Only Proof. Yeah, I'm going to come up with awesome poetic titles like that every now and then. Shakespearean titles. But think about this. Grace and truth is the only proof, right? And that's how I came to Christ from atheism. I needed to understand both and embrace both. And when we're talking about grace and truth is the only proof, the proof of our living God, the proof of the Scriptures, the proof of Jesus, as a reality in our lives and as a reality to the world. Grace and truth. They both have to be there. If it's just truth or just grace, it's not going to work. I'll give you an example of grace. So I've been copper mining before I came here and before I worked at other places for almost 20 years. And it's a very dangerous environment. We have to wear steel-toe boots, sometimes water boots, and it's very uncomfortable and very dangerous. So there's certain situations where rocks get in your shoe, and you can't take off your boots because you're going to expose everything else and you'll be in more danger. So you have to walk around with a rock in your shoe, and then it's cutting in your foot, right? It's a little pebble, but it's just cutting and cutting and cutting. And then you're just telling yourself, grace. I'm just going to ignore it. Grace, 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 right? Grace, 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 grace. Even though the pebble's destroying my foot. But if I don't pull the pebble out, what happens, right? It's going to get infected, and it's going to get gangrene. They're going to have to cut my leg off. You see, that's the worst case scenario if I don't pull the pebble out. But truth is I actually take the shoe off and I expose the pebble. You see, that's truth, and I remove it. That's truth, you see. But how important is it? Both at the same time. In relationships, in evangelism. When it comes to evangelism, if we just talk about truth, we kind of talked about this morning in class. Not forceful, not coercion, but out of love we should share the gospel. Right? Hebrews 4:12 says that the word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, but sometimes we take the word of God and instead of using it like a sword, we turn it like this on the flat edge of the sword and go, bam, 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 right? You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. You see, truth, 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 but no grace. How does that work? Well, in class we talked about how that really doesn't work, does it? That just scares people away or makes people upset and they don't feel loved. You see, grace and truth. And that's how Jesus came, isn't it? When we look at John chapter 1, we're going to see a couple principles here. A couple points. So there's 2 points. Grace and truth is the only proof, but there's 2 points. There's a principle of grace and truth that we're going to start on, and then how Jesus gave grace and truth. So the principle of grace and truth, I think this is my clicker here, starting in John chapter 1, verse 14. Notice it says, and Hugh read this, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw His glory. How do we see that? Right? In many instances of all of the Scriptures, Old Testament and New, His glory is manifested, but this is specific. The glory as of the only begotten Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. You see that? Not just truth and not just grace. Verse 15, John saying, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. Verse 16, for his fullness, see that? Fullness we all have received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. That's truth. Grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. You see the perfect balance. I can't even call it that. I can't even say there's a ratio because he's all of both. You see, I can't say it's a 50-50 or balance. He's grace and truth. That's who God is. That's who Jesus is. All right, so you know how we talk about how the Old Testament points to Jesus. And in Luke 24, Jesus tells his 2 disciples that Moses to Malachi are talking about him and all the things that must be fulfilled. When we look at Isaiah chapter 40, we're not going to spend too much time here, but I just want to remind us of how beautiful Isaiah is, and it talks about the gospel. And we're going to talk about the attributes of grace and truth from Isaiah 40 also. If you haven't heard this before, or if you have heard this, I will remind you. So when you look at Isaiah as a whole, it's 66 books, right? And then when you look at Isaiah chapters 1 through 39, many people have seen it as, scholars have seen it as, chapters 1 through 39 is a representation of the Old Testament, Old Covenant, condemnation and wrath. And then when you get to Isaiah chapter 40, all the way to 66, that's a representation of the New Testament, the New Covenant. All of a sudden you see comfort and peace and hope and grace. You see, and it's more than just a theory. If you study these chapters carefully, which I think you guys have, because I remember Jeff was bringing up Isaiah, you see pictures of the gospel from 40 to 66, but beyond that, you see specific points in ministry of Jesus Christ from Isaiah chapters 40 to 66. You see him preaching against the Pharisees. You see him give his great invitation. You see him talk about the church as the bride. You see, it's a beautiful picture. But Isaiah chapter 40 is where everything turns. And Isaiah chapter 40 verse 1 says, comfort my people, says your God. See? Verse 2, speak kindly to Jerusalem and call out to her that her warfare has ended, that her iniquity has been removed, that she has received the Lord's hand double for all her sins. And that's actually a good thing. You see? Pardon, forgiveness. Verse 3, a voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. Does that sound familiar? Don't all the Gospels in the beginning of the Gospels talk about this? And who is that talking about? John the Baptist. You see, right at the get-go, you see the beginning of the New Testament, starting in Isaiah 40. Verse 4, let every valley be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low, and let the rough ground become plain, and the rugged terrain a broad valley. Isaiah 40, verse 5. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed. Isn't that what we just read about in John 1? Yeah. The Lord's glory was revealed in the flesh through Jesus. And all flesh will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice says, call out. Then he answered, what shall I call out? All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. 1 Peter chapter 1 quotes this. Peter says that this is the gospel that was written to us and given to us. He says that specifically in 1 Peter chapter 1. You see? Now we're going to get to the grace and truth aspects. Watch this. Verse 9. Get yourself up on a high mountain, O Zion, bearer of good news. Lift up your voice mightily, O Jerusalem, bearer of good news. Lift up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. Remember Judah? Jesus came from Judah, right? There's many prophecies that talk about how Judah is going to be through Judah people will be saved. Look at verse 10. Behold, the Lord our God, watch this, will come with might, in his arm ruling for him. That's truth, right? Authority, truth. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense, I say that on purpose like that, like recompensating, a type of judgment or repaying. His recompense before him, that's truth. But look at verse 11. Like a shepherd, he will tend his flock. In his arm, he will gather the lambs and carry them in his bosom. He will gently lead the nursing ewes. You see that? That's grace. Truth and grace. Attributes of God. And in this context, it's a prophecy of the gospel to come to all nations. Isn't that beautiful? All right. Let's keep going. So point number 2, see, it's pretty fast. How Jesus gave grace and truth. And we're going to examine from John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. Okay, so this is one of the ultimate examples of Jesus giving grace and truth. So let's go to John chapter 8, starting in verse 1. All right, so you know all the story. I mean, you all know the story. Did I say that twice? So this woman is accused of adultery. She was caught in the very act. The Jews want to stone her, but they do it on purpose. They drag her to the temple on purpose, trying to accuse her and throw her before Jesus and say, hey, the law of Moses says we're supposed to stone her. What do you say? And it says that they're trying to test him. That's the only reason why they're doing this, right? That's the general story. But let's start in verse 1. John chapter 8, verse 1, how Jesus gave grace and truth. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Look carefully at verse 2. Early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. You ever think that some details really don't mean much? It's it's just when you're studying the Bible early in the morning, well, it says that a million places in the Bible, so that's no big deal. Very specific. Why does God, through John, indicate early in the morning came into the temple? That matters. Because what happened early in the morning in the temple daily, I'm going to show you right now. What did the Jews do early in the morning in the temple? When you look at Exodus 29, verses 30 to 41, it says, Now this is what you shall offer on the altar, 2-year-old lambs each day continuously. The one lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at twilight. And there shall be 1/10 of ephah of flour mixed with 1/4 of hin of beaten oil, and 1/4 of hin of wine for a drink offering with one lamb. The other lamb you shall offer at twilight. Shall offer it with the same grain offering and the same drink offering as in the morning for a soothing aroma, an offering by fire to the Lord. What did they do in the morning? What did the Jews do in the morning typically in the temple or in the tabernacle? They made sacrifices for their sin. You see? How ironic. You see? I'm going to give you another example. From 2 Chronicles chapter 13, I'm going to actually turn there. I'm going to go over a few extra passages. 2 Chronicles chapter 13, and the context there is actually in line with the 2 Kings 12, 13, where there's a divided kingdom. Rehoboam and Jeroboam are at war, but Rehoboam dies, and Abijah takes over. Abijah was not a perfect king. He did evil on the side of the Lord, but this chapter happens to put him in a good light, happens to speak well of him. And I'll show you why right now. So when you look at 2 Chronicles, starting in verse 10, what's going on here is Jeroboam is at war with Abijah. Jeroboam has double the men of Abijah, and they're fighting each other. And so look at what Abijah says. And look what Abijah is doing in verse 10. He says, But as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him. And the sons of Aaron are ministering to the Lord as priests, and the Levites attend to their work. So Abijah is saying, hey, we haven't forsaken God. We're worshiping the way that God always wanted us to worship. Look at verse 11. Every morning, see, that's what I want to emphasize. Every morning and evening they burn to the Lord burnt offerings and fragrant incense, and the showbread is set on the clean table, and the golden lampstand with its lamps is ready to light every evening. For we keep charge of the Lord our God, but you have forsaken him. He's talking to the Israelites, the non-Judeans, Judah's tribe. Now watch this. This is what happens in the battle. In verse 13, But Jeroboam has set an ambush to come from the rear so that Israel was in front of Judah, and the ambush was behind them. So Abijah and his men are going to get ambushed. Sneaky, right? And remember, Jeroboam has double the men, and he's ambushing Abijah. Now look at verse 14. When Judah turned around, behold, they were attacked both front and rear. So they cried to the Lord, and the priests blew the trumpets. Verse 15, Then the men of Judah raised the war cry, and when the men of Judah raised the war cry, then it was God that routed Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. See, God won that battle through them. And look at the reason why. Verse 17, Abijah and his people defeated them with a great slaughter, so that 500,000 chosen men of Israel fell slain. Thus the sons of Israel were subdued at this time, and the sons of Judah conquered. Why? Because they trusted in the Lord, the God of their fathers. You see that? You see the big picture? I didn't want to spend too much time in this chapter, but long story short, the main verse that I want to share with you is on the screen right there from this chapter. Every morning, they were faithful to worship God according to what he asked them to do. They were faithful to that. And look at the things that happened. Look at the things that took place because of that. God was on their side. God honored them. God protected them. You see? Because they trusted God. And that's why they worshiped. You see, if you put two and two together, they didn't worship to look good, like Isaiah chapter 1 talks about. They worshiped God because they trusted him in that moment. You see, and that's one of the reasons why we should. Out of love for him, out of trust for him, that's why we should worship him. Not because like, hey, look at all the rules I keep and look at how faithful I am because I do X, Y, Z, right? That's the wrong mindset. It should be because I trust you, I love you, I want to please you, God, not for ourselves to look good like the Pharisees, you see? All right, so you see the point? We're in the temple. Let's go back to John chapter 8. We're in the temple. It's the morning time. Jews are making sacrifices for their sin in this moment. How ironic that they dragged this woman in to stone her while they're supposed to be making sacrifices for their sin. All right. Verse 3, John chapter 8. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the center of the court. Why? The stoning was supposed to happen outside. Remember that? And they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. And it's probably true. Likely true. Regardless. We'll talk about that in a second. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. What then do you say? You see, they're testing him. And it's going to say that in the next couple of verses. Remember Leviticus 24:23? The man's supposed to be stoned too, right? Both guilty parties are supposed to be stoned. Where's the man? You see? Why just her? And we ask what the motives are. We see later that testing. And so ask ourselves, let's give some application here. What are our motives for sharing the gospel with people? You see? Is it love? Is it grace and truth? Or is it just, I just want to be right and prove a point? You see? I just want to show off my knowledge. I just want to make you feel like a fool because you don't know what you're talking about. You see, we've got to really look at our hearts and ask why we're sharing the gospel with people. Jesus was sinless. That's what 1 Peter 2:22 says. You see? That means he didn't break God's commandments, didn't break God's law. However, he's not all about stoning her right now, is he? He's not like, yeah, let's do it. I agree. You see? We'll see what happens. It was justified to stone her, maybe. But he didn't say, go ahead, stone her. You're right. Verse 6 in John chapter 8. They were saying this, testing him. See, that God reveals exactly what they're doing. So they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. Isn't that awesome? Verse 7, but they persisted in asking him. He straightened up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Nobody knows what he wrote. That isn't the point. But if you remember another time in Scripture when the hand, something that appeared to be a man's hand, finger of God wrote in Daniel chapter 5, verse 5, and verses 24 and 28 describe how the king at the time was numbered, weighed, and divided. God was placing judgment on him. See, the finger of truth placing judgment on someone that deserved judgment. You see that? Now it's being contrasted with the finger of Jesus, and Jesus stands up and says, whoever hasn't sinned in here, you throw the first stone. You see that? So it's like the finger of truth contrasting the finger of grace. Isn't that awesome? All right. Verse 9. I love how this happens. When they heard it, when all that crowd heard it, the people that were so adamant about stoning this woman and accusing this woman, when they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones. Ooh. They dropped their stones and they walked out. Beginning with the older ones. Why the older ones? Why are the older ones leaving first? Remember, every morning in the temple, people were making sacrifices for their sins. The Jews grew up going to the temple every morning, making sacrifices for their sins. So the older people that have had more years, more time, more days to make sacrifices for their sins every single day, realize, what am I doing? I'm a sinner. And they leave. And then the younger ones realize, what am I doing? I'm a sinner. And then they leave. You see? And the same thing can go to, why do we go to church? Do we go to church to prove that we're better than other people? Do we go to church to get points, earning our way to heaven? Or is it because we're all sinners? And this is a hospital place, this is a hospital to meet the great physician for restoration and to have a relationship with God, you see? Because we're all sinners. That's why we assemble and encourage each other. That's why we lift each other up and remind each other every single week, should be every single day, what Jesus has done for us. And they were saved by grace. Yes, the truth brought us to that grace. But we got to remember that. And you know, if we come to church to throw stones, we're here for the wrong reasons. You see? Why was Jesus left only with the woman alone? Because he's the one guy that didn't sin, right? He didn't have to walk out. And he wasn't holding a stone either. But look what he does instead. And she's alone crying, right? In the center of the court. And look what Jesus does. He straightens up and he says to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" Verse 11, she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus says, "I do not condemn you either." That's grace, isn't it? She broke the law. The law was clear. It was absolutely clear that the penalty was death. But Jesus showed her grace. But it didn't end there. Truth. Go. From now on, sin no more. That's truth. That's repentance. And we all need both. We need forgiveness, but with that forgiveness, we're supposed to turn the other direction and live for God. You see? So remember, the goal is restoration, not condemnation. When we share Jesus with the lost, when we share Jesus with our family, when we share Jesus with each other, the goal is restoration, relationship with God, not condemnation. Grace and truth is the only proof. So remember the 2 points, the principle of grace and truth and how Jesus gave grace and truth. But thank you so much for your time and attention. And it's a beautiful Lord's Day, and I pray that we all meditate on these things and put these things in our hearts and live these things out. Jesus said, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved." If you guys are ready to receive grace and truth, if anybody's out there to receive grace and truth, we invite you to come up here as we stand and sing.